down to his last $500 and facing eviction after losing his tech startup in Silicon Valley, Ethan Reeves made what everyone called a foolish decision, buying an abandoned farm in rural Vermont that no one had lived in for over 30 years. What he discovered hidden in the attic would not only change his life forever, but would uncover a historical secret that powerful people had been searching for across 3 generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ethan Reeves stared at his bank account balance on his smartphone screen, $517.22. The number seemed to mock him, a digital reminder of how far he had fallen. Just 18 months ago, he had been the CEO of NeuroSync, a promising artificial intelligence startup in Palo Alto with 20 employees, 2 rounds of successful funding, and a valuation that had briefly touched 8 figures. He had owned a Tesla, leased a luxury apartment overlooking the bay, and been featured in tech magazines as one of Silicon Valley's entrepreneurs to watch. Now, at 36, he was living out of his decade-old Honda Civic, showering at a local gym, and stretching every dollar to its breaking point. The tech downturn had been merciless, wiping out countless startups, but Ethan's fall had been particularly dramatic. A promised investment round had fallen through at the last minute, leaving him personally liable for loans he'd guaranteed. When NeuroSync collapsed, he lost everything: his company, his savings, his apartment, and finally his reputation in the tight-knit tech community. "You're too stubborn for your own good, Ethan," his sister Olivia had said during their last conversation. "There's no shame in coming home until you get back on your feet." But pride was the only asset Ethan had managed to keep intact. He had refused his sister's offer to move in with her family in Chicago, determined to rebuild his life on his own terms, to prove that his failure wasn't permanent. As he sat in his car outside a public library, using their free Wi-Fi to search for job opportunities, Ethan noticed an email he had initially dismissed as spam. The subject line read, "Rural property auction, listings starting at $500. Something about it caught his attention. Perhaps the coincidence of the amount matching almost exactly what he had left, or perhaps the growing realization that Silicon Valley had nothing left to offer him. The auction site featured dozens of foreclosed properties, most with starting bids far beyond his means. But as Ethan scrolled through the listings, one property stood out: an abandoned farmhouse with 15 acres of overgrown land in a small town called Mapleton, Vermont. The minimum bid was listed at $500, with a note indicating that the property had been in tax default for years and required significant rehabilitation. The listing included several photos showing a weathered 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint, a sagging porch, and broken windows. The surrounding land was overgrown, with what had once been fields now reclaimed by nature. According to the description, the house had no functioning utilities and would need complete restoration. It looked, in a word, hopeless, yet something about the property spoke to Ethan. Perhaps it was the desperate need for a fresh start, or perhaps it was the memory of childhood summers spent at his grandparents' farm in Minnesota. The peace he had found there, so different from the frantic pace of his adult life in tech. Whatever the reason, Ethan found himself registering for the online auction scheduled for the following morning. That night, Sleeping in his reclined driver's seat in a Walmart parking lot, Ethan researched Mapleton, Vermont. The town was small, with fewer than 2,000 residents, located about 30 miles from Burlington. Once a thriving agricultural community, it had suffered the same decline as many rural American towns, with younger generations leaving for cities and few new businesses opening. Property values were low, but so were job prospects. What would he even do there? The question lingered as he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Ethan positioned himself in the library again, a full cup of coffee beside his laptop, waiting for the auction to begin. When the bidding opened for the Mapleton property, he expected competition. To his surprise, as the minutes ticked by, no bids appeared. With just 1 minute remaining, Ethan entered his bid, $500, the entirety of what he had left in the world. "Congratulations," the screen flashed moments later. "You are the winning bidder for property C-172, 145 Old Mill Road, Mapleton, VT. Ethan sat back, a mixture of elation and panic washing over him. He had just spent his last dollars on a dilapidated farmhouse in a town where he knew no one, had no job prospects, and had never even visited. Was this rock bottom, or the beginning of something new? The auction company's follow-up email contained the details for completing the purchase. The property was being sold as is, with all back taxes forgiven as part of the sale. Ethan would need to sign the paperwork in person at the county clerk's office in Vermont within 7 days or forfeit his bid. With nothing holding him in California, Ethan packed his few remaining possessions into his Honda that same afternoon. The drive to Vermont would take nearly 4 days, a cross-country journey that mirrored the massive life transition he was undertaking. As the familiar landscape of the West Coast disappeared in his rearview mirror, Ethan felt a strange mixture of terror and freedom. He had $17, $22 left in his account, a quarter tank of gas, and a farm waiting for him on the other side of the country. Ethan drove strategically, sleeping at rest stops to avoid hotel costs, and rationing his food to dry cereal and peanut butter sandwiches. He picked up odd jobs along the way, helping an elderly couple unload groceries in Nebraska, assisting a truck driver with a flat tire in Ohio, doing 3 hours of data entry for a small business in Pennsylvania when the owner spotted him working on his laptop at a local cafe. Each small job provided just enough money for gas and basic necessities. To continue his journey, as he crossed into Vermont on the 4th day, the landscape transformed into rolling hills and dense forests, occasionally broken by small towns and farms. The GPS on his phone directed him to Mapleton, a collection of buildings around a central square that looked like it hadn't changed much in the past 50 years. Ethan parked outside the county clerk's office, stretching his legs after the final 4-hour drive from his last rest stop. The small brick building had an American flag fluttering above the entrance and a bulletin board covered with community notices by the door. Inside, a woman in her 60s looked up from a computer that appeared almost as old as she was. Her name tag read, "Margaret Winters, County Clerk." "Can I help you?" she asked, peering at him over reading glasses. "I'm Ethan Reeves. I'm here about the property on Old Mill Road. I won it in the online auction." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "The old Caldwell place? Well, I'll be. We've been trying to auction that property for 3 years now. Never thought someone would actually buy it." She studied him with newfound interest. "You're not from around here?" "No, I'm from California originally." "California?" She seemed even more surprised. "And you came all this way for the Caldwell farm? Did you know the Caldwells?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I just needed a change." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Well, you've certainly found one. That place has been empty since old Samuel Caldwell disappeared in '87. His son tried to keep it going for a few years, but—" She shrugged. "Some places just seem to resist new beginnings." Ethan felt a chill at her words. "Disappeared? Oh, it's ancient history now," Margaret said, turning to a filing cabinet. "Samuel was in his 70s, suffered from dementia, according to Dr. Patterson. Most likely wandered off into the woods. They searched for weeks, but—" She pulled out a folder. "Anyway, let's get this paperwork sorted. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transaction was surprisingly simple. Because the property had been in tax default for so long, the county was eager to get it back on the tax rolls under new ownership. Ethan signed multiple forms, paid a small processing fee that nearly emptied his wallet, and within 30 minutes was handed the deed and a set of tarnished keys. "These might not even work anymore," Margaret warned, handing over the keys. "Place has been broken into over the years, local kids using it for dares and such." As Ethan turned to leave, Margaret called after him. "Mr. Reeves, a bit of advice from someone who's lived here all her life. Mapleton's a close community. We look after our own, but we're cautious with newcomers, especially those interested in the Caldwell place." "Is there something I should know about the property?" Ethan asked. Margaret seemed to consider her words carefully. "Just, if you find anything unusual there, anything that seems important. There are people in town who might have a special interest. The Harrington family, for one. They've had their eye on that land for decades." She paused. "And be careful in that house. Old buildings can hide old dangers." With that cryptic warning, Ethan left the county building, deed in hand, wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. Finding Old Mill Road required Ethan to drive 5 miles outside of Mapleton's town center. The road itself was poorly maintained, with cracks where vegetation pushed through the asphalt. A rusted mailbox, marked with faded numbers, was the only indication he had reached his destination. The driveway was completely overgrown, forcing Ethan to park on the road and walk the last quarter-mile to the house. As he approached, the farmhouse loomed larger and more dilapidated than it had appeared in the photos. 2 stories of weathered clapboard, with a steep roof missing several shingles, and a wraparound porch that sagged dangerously on one side. Windows were broken or boarded up, and vines climbed the walls like they were trying to pull the structure back into the earth. Beyond the house stood a barn that leaned precariously to one side, its red paint faded to a dull pink. The surrounding fields, once cleared for crops, were now a tangle of tall grasses, young trees, and wild blackberry bushes. Nature had been reclaiming this farm for decades. Ethan stood before the house, keys in hand, a wave of doubt crashing over him. What had he been thinking? He knew nothing about farming, carpentry, or rural living. He had spent his entire adult life in cities, working with technology and algorithms, not soil and timber. Yet there was something compelling about the old farm's desolation. It matched his own. Both of them abandoned, written off, forgotten. Perhaps they could rebuild together. The front door screeched in protest as Ethan forced it open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, casting narrow beams that illuminated swirling dust particles. The entryway opened to a living room with a stone fireplace, its mantel still holding faded photographs in rusted frames. A threadbare couch and 2 armchairs remained, along with a coffee table covered in what appeared to be decades of dust and debris. To the right was a dining room, the table still set with china plates, as if waiting for dinner guests who never arrived. Beyond that, a kitchen with ancient appliances, a refrigerator with rounded corners from the 1950s, a heavy cast-iron stove, and cabinets whose doors hung at odd angles. A staircase led to the second floor, where Ethan found 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. The master bedroom contained a 4-poster bed, the sheets still on it, now home to what appeared to be a family of mice that scattered as he entered. Throughout the house, personal belongings remained as if the occupants had simply vanished one day. Clothes in closets, books on shelves, family photographs on walls. It felt less like an abandoned property and more like a time capsule, preserved, but decaying. Ethan's exploration eventually led him to a narrow door off the upstairs hallway. It opened to reveal a steep staircase leading to the attic. With only the flashlight on his phone to guide him, Ethan climbed cautiously, the stairs creaking ominously beneath his weight. The attic ran the length of the house, with a pitched ceiling that forced him to stoop in places. Dust motes danced in the beams of light coming through small dormer windows. Like the rest of the house, the attic was filled with forgotten items, trunks, furniture draped in sheets, boxes of old clothes, and farming implements whose purpose Ethan couldn't begin to guess. As he swept his light across the space, something glinted in the far corner. Curious, Ethan picked his way through the maze of forgotten possessions. What had caught the light was a metal lockbox, about the size of a small suitcase, partially hidden beneath an old quilt. Heart racing with unexpected excitement, Ethan pulled the box into the center of the room where the light was better. It was locked, but the hasp was rusted. After a few minutes of working at it with a screwdriver he'd found among the tools downstairs, the lock gave way with a snap. Ethan lifted the lid slowly, unsure what to expect. Inside, he found several bundles of cash. Old bills, many from the 1960s and 70s, bound with rubber bands that crumbled as he touched them. A quick count revealed just over $25,000. While not exactly a fortune by modern standards, to Ethan, who had arrived with less than $20 to his name, it seemed like unimaginable wealth. But the money wasn't the only thing in the box. Beneath the cash was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, and a manila envelope containing what appeared to be old photographs and letters. The journal's first page bore a name written in careful penmanship: Property of Samuel J. Caldwell, 1952-1987. As Ethan began to flip through the journal, he realized it was no ordinary diary. The pages contained detailed notes, sketches, and what appeared to be coordinates or measurements. Many entries referenced the site and the discovery, though without context, their meaning remained obscure. The handwriting became increasingly erratic in later entries, with some passages underlined multiple times or circled for emphasis. The final entry, dated August 17, 1987, presumably shortly before Samuel's disappearance, read simply, "They're getting closer. I've hidden everything where only a worthy successor would think to look. The map is in the place where memory lives, but decay cannot touch." The manila envelope contained black and white photographs of Samuel Caldwell with various men in what appeared to be field research settings, some in wooded areas, others in what looked like caves or excavation sites. On the back of one photo was written, "The Fellowship 1964, with 5 names listed below, including Samuel's. As the daylight began to fade, Ethan realized he had spent hours in the attic. With no electricity in the house, he would need to prepare for nightfall. He carefully repacked everything into the lockbox except for $500, a symbolic amount matching what he had paid for the farm, which he put in his wallet. Ethan carried the lockbox downstairs to the master bedroom where he planned to sleep. Despite the dusty conditions, before darkness fell completely, he made a quick trip to his car to retrieve his sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, and the few provisions he had left. That night, lying in his sleeping bag on the old mattress, Ethan could hear the house settling around him, creaks and groans like the building itself was trying to tell him its secrets. Outside, crickets chirped, and occasionally an owl hooted, sounds that were foreign to his urban-trained ears. By the light of his lantern, Ethan again examined the journal, trying to make sense of Samuel Caldwell's cryptic notes. References to the artifact, the true history, and what they don't want found appeared frequently, but without context, they remained mysterious. Whatever Samuel Caldwell had discovered, he had been secretive about it, perhaps even paranoid. The most frequent references were to a place called Raven's Point and something called the Washington Connection. There were also repeated mentions of someone referred to only as H, who seemed to be a threat or adversary of some kind. As exhaustion from his long journey finally caught up with him, Ethan set the journal aside. Tomorrow he would need to assess the farm more thoroughly, figure out how to make the house habitable, and perhaps begin to understand what exactly Samuel Caldwell had been involved in, and why the county clerk had warned him about the Harrington family's interest in the property. Despite the uncertainty of his situation, Ethan fell asleep with a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in months. The abandoned farm had already yielded one treasure. What other secrets might it be hiding? The following morning, Ethan woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom's broken blinds and the sound of a vehicle coming up the overgrown driveway. Quickly, he hid the lockbox under the bed and went to the window. A pickup truck had stopped in front of the house, and a man in his 60s was getting out, surveying the property with apparent interest. Ethan hurried downstairs and opened the front door just as the man was about to knock. "Morning," the visitor said, seeming unsurprised to find someone in the supposedly abandoned house. "Name's Frank Donovan. Own the hardware store in town. Heard someone finally bought old Samuel's place." His eyes, sharp despite his age, took in Ethan's rumpled appearance. "Looks like you might be needing a few supplies." "Ethan Reeves," Ethan introduced himself, extending his hand. "And yes, I think I'll be needing quite a bit. The place is—" He gestured around him. "A project." Frank nodded, shaking Ethan's hand with a grip that suggested years of physical labor. "That's putting it mildly. Been empty for more than 30 years. Margaret at the county office called me. Thought I might be able to help you get situated." He paused, his gaze traveling over the house again. "Mind if I come in? I knew Samuel back in the day. Haven't been inside since before he vanished." Ethan hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. Something told him that in a small town like Mapleton, making allies would be crucial. and Frank seemed genuinely friendly. As they walked through the house, Frank provided commentary on what repairs would be most urgent. The roof, certainly. The electrical wiring, which had likely been chewed through by rodents. The plumbing, which would need to be checked for leaks and freeze damage. "Well, you've got your work cut out for you," Frank said as they completed the tour. "But the bones of this place are good. Samuel built it to last." "You knew him well?" Ethan asked, watching Frank carefully. Frank's expression became guarded. "Well enough. We were in the same graduating class back in '54. Went different ways after that. He went off to college, came back with all sorts of new ideas. Started farming differently from his father, experimenting with things." He shook his head. "Some folks in town didn't take to that, thought he was putting on airs." "Like the Harringtons," Ethan ventured, recalling Margaret's warning. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "Margaret mentioned them, did she? Well, she would. Her cousin married a Harrington." He sighed. "Look, every small town has its politics, its old feuds. The Harringtons and the Caldwells had their differences, going back generations. William Harrington, he runs Harrington Development now. He's been trying to get his hands on this property for years. Wanted to turn it into some kind of resort or retirement community." "Is that why no one bid on it at the auction?" Frank chuckled, but there was little humor in it. "People around here are superstitious. After Samuel disappeared, rumors flew. Some said he went crazy at the end, others that he found something on his land that he shouldn't have. The property got a reputation. Besides, the Harringtons let it be known they were interested, and most locals wouldn't cross them. But you're telling me this because you're not from around here," Frank said simply. "You deserve to know what you've stepped into, and because Samuel was a friend, and whatever happened to him, he deserved better than to have his life's work forgotten." Ethan considered this. What exactly was his life's work? The farm. Frank hesitated. Farming was what he did to pay the bills. But Samuel's passion was history, local history specifically. He was convinced that the textbooks got it all wrong about this area, about who was here first and what happened to them. He shrugged. "Like I said, some thought he was eccentric, but he was dedicated, I'll give him that." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching. Through the window, Ethan saw a sleek black SUV pull up beside Frank's truck. "That'll be William Harrington," Frank muttered, his expression darkening. "Doesn't waste any time, does he?" The man who emerged from the SUV was in his 50s, dressed in what Ethan recognized as expensive casual wear, the kind of clothing that signaled wealth without appearing to try too hard. He moved with the confidence of someone used to getting his way. "Might as well get this over with," Frank said, moving toward the door. "Word of advice. William likes to come on strong. Don't let him pressure you." As they stepped onto the porch, William Harrington was already approaching, a practiced smile on his face. "Frank, good to see you," he said smoothly, before turning his attention to Ethan. "And you must be our California investor, William Harrington." He extended his hand. "Welcome to Mapleton." Ethan shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the assessing look in Harrington's eyes. "Ethan Reeves. Not sure I'd call myself an investor, though." "No? What would you call someone who buys property sight unseen from across the country?" Harrington's tone was light, but the question felt pointed. "Someone looking for a fresh start," Ethan replied evenly. Harrington nodded, as if Ethan had confirmed something for him. "Well, in that case, I may have a proposition that interests you. I've had my eye on this property for some time, been trying to acquire it for a development project that would bring jobs and tourism to our little town. He gestured expansively at the overgrown fields. I'd be willing to take it off your hands, save you the headache of renovations, say $5,000, 10 times your investment if I heard correctly. The offer was tempting. Ethan couldn't deny that. With $5,000, he could rent an apartment, buy professional clothes, and have enough runway to job hunt properly. But something held him back. The journal in the attic, Samuel's cryptic final entry, the warning from both Margaret, and now Frank's obvious distrust of Harrington. "I appreciate the offer," Ethan said carefully, "but I think I'd like to explore the possibilities here first." Harrington's smile remained fixed, but something hardened in his eyes. "Of course. Just wanted to put it out there before you get too settled." He reached into his pocket and produced a business card. "My offer stands for the next week. After that, well, old properties like this can become money pits very quickly." As Harrington turned to leave, he added almost casually, "By the way, if you happen to find any of old Samuel's papers or research materials, I'd be very interested. My father and he worked together occasionally. Family history, you understand." After Harrington drove away, Frank let out a low whistle. Well, that was direct, even for William. Must really want this place. "Why?" Ethan asked, watching the SUV disappear down the road. "What's so special about this farm?" Frank shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it? Samuel thought he'd found something important here. Historically significant. The Harringtons always dismissed it publicly, called him a crackpot. But privately," he shrugged, "they've been trying to get this land since before Samuel disappeared." As Frank prepared to leave, promising to return with some basic supplies and tools, Ethan found himself with more questions than when he'd started the day. What had Samuel Caldwell discovered? Why were the Harringtons so interested in the property? And most importantly, what did the cryptic message in the journal mean? The map is in the place where memory lives, but decay cannot touch. Standing in the doorway of his newly acquired, crumbling farmhouse, Ethan felt a surge of determination. For the first time since his company collapsed, he had something to focus on beyond mere survival. There was a mystery here, one that had been waiting decades to be solved, and perhaps solving it was exactly the fresh start he needed. Finding Old Mill Road required Ethan to drive 5 miles outside of Mapleton's town center, following increasingly narrow and neglected roads. When he finally turned onto the property's long driveway, tall grass scraped the underside of his Honda Civic. The farmhouse gradually came into view, a 2-story colonial structure that had once been painted white but was now a patchwork of peeling paint and weathered wood. The sagging porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house, and several windows were broken or boarded up. Ethan parked and stepped out, taking in his new property with a mixture of trepidation and determination. The silence was profound. No traffic noise, no voices, just the rustle of leaves and occasional birdsong. After years in the constant hum of Silicon Valley, the quiet felt almost supernatural. The front door opened with a protesting creak, revealing a dusty interior where time seemed to have stopped decades ago. Furniture remained positioned as if awaiting the return of owners long gone. A threadbare sofa facing a stone fireplace, a dining table still set with tarnished silverware, bookshelves lined with volumes whose spines had faded in the sunlight that once streamed through now grimy windows. "What have I gotten myself into?" Ethan murmured, his voice seeming unnaturally loud in the abandoned house. He spent that first day exploring, cataloguing the extent of the necessary repairs. The roof leaked in multiple places, creating water, damage in the upstairs bedrooms. Mice had nested in the walls, chewing through wiring and insulation. The plumbing, when he tried the faucets, produced only rust-colored spurts before running dry. The cellar contained an ancient furnace that looked like it had last functioned during the Carter administration. As daylight began to fade, Ethan realized he had no electricity, no running water, and no proper bed. He returned to his car and retrieved his meager possessions: a sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, some bottled water, and the few non-perishable food items he had left from his cross-country journey. That first night, lying in his sleeping bag on the dusty floor of what had once been the living room, Ethan questioned the impulsive decision that had brought him here. The house creaked and settled around him, its unfamiliar noises keeping him alert long into the night. When he finally did sleep, his dreams were filled with images of the previous owner, Samuel Caldwell, a man he'd never met, but whose possessions now surrounded him. Morning brought new determination. Ethan used the $25,000 he'd found in the attic to open an account at Mapleton's small local bank, depositing most of it but keeping $5,000 in cash for immediate needs. The bank manager, a woman named Helen Fitzgerald, had raised her eyebrows at the worn bills, but asked no questions beyond the necessary formalities. With money in his pocket for the first time in months, Ethan drove to Frank Donovan's hardware store on Mapleton's Main Street. The bell above the door jangled as he entered, announcing his presence in a shop that looked like it hadn't changed its inventory or decor since the 1970s. Frank emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, Mr. Reeves, thought you might be in today. How was your first night at the Caldwell place?" "Educational," Ethan replied with a rueful smile. "I've got a list of priorities longer than my arm." Frank nodded sagely. "Always the way with old houses. Let me guess, roof, plumbing, electricity, in that order? You've done this before. Once or twice?" Frank chuckled. "Let's start with tools. Can't fix much without the basics." An hour later, Ethan's cart was filled with hammers, screwdrivers, wrenches, a circular saw, work gloves, and dozens of other essentials. Frank added items Ethan hadn't considered: a propane camp stove, a water purification system, industrial garbage bags, and heavy-duty cleaning supplies. "Water's your first real problem," Frank advised as he rang up the purchases. "You've got a well on the property, but it'll need to be cleaned and possibly re-drilled. Until then, you can fill these containers at the public tap behind the town hall." As Frank loaded the supplies into Ethan's car, he hesitated, then said, "You know, there are some folks in town who could help with the heavy work. Marty Simmons does roofing, Seth Parker's good with electrical, and my nephew Jake can handle plumbing. They charge fair rates." Ethan considered his dwindling funds. "I appreciate that, but I'm trying to stretch my budget. Thought I'd tackle what I could myself, at least for now." Frank studied him for a moment. "Tell you what, come by the Crossroads Diner tomorrow, around 6:30. Some of us old-timers have breakfast there most mornings. Might be good for you to meet a few people, maybe work out some barter arrangements. Folks around here still do that, you know. Trade skills instead of money when times are tight." The idea appealed to Ethan. In Silicon Valley, networking had been about strategic connections and leveraging relationships. Perhaps in Mapleton, it could be simpler. human connections based on mutual need and goodwill. Back at the farm, Ethan began the daunting task of cleaning out decades of dust, debris, and animal nests. He worked methodically, one room at a time, starting with the kitchen. By sunset, he had cleared enough space to set up his camp stove and create a semi-functional living area. It wasn't much, but it was progress. That evening, as he ate a simple meal of canned soup warmed on the propane stove, Ethan returned to the lockbox from the attic. In addition to the cash, it contained Samuel Caldwell's journal and a collection of old photographs. The journal was filled with cryptic notes about historical research, archaeological findings, and references to something called the Washington Truth. Many entries documented visits to various historical sites throughout New England, with particular focus on Revolutionary War-era locations. Caldwell had been obsessed with challenging conventional historical narratives, particularly regarding George Washington and events from 1777-1778. One photograph showed Samuel with a group of men standing before what appeared to be an archaeological dig. On the back was written, "The Fellowship, 1964, followed by 5 names: Samuel Caldwell, Richard Thompson, Martin Harrington, James Whitaker, and Benjamin Chen." The name Harrington caught Ethan's attention immediately. Was this Martin Harrington related to William, the man who had offered to buy the farm? And what was the Fellowship? The final entries in Samuel's journal became increasingly paranoid. He wrote about being watched, about them trying to suppress his research, about needing to protect the evidence. The very last entry, dated just days before his reported disappearance, read, "If you're reading this, they may have already come for me. The truth is hidden where it all began, beneath the stone where blood was spilled but history forgotten. Trust no one from the families. The map is where memory lives, but decay cannot touch." Ethan studied the cryptic message, turning the words over in his mind. Where memory lives, but decay cannot touch. What could that mean? Photographs, digital storage, something preserved or protected somehow. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. Instinctively, Ethan closed the journal and tucked it under a cushion before moving to the window. A pickup truck was coming up the drive. Not Frank's, but an older model he didn't recognize. The truck parked, and a woman stepped out, mid-30s. Perhaps with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms. She carried a canvas bag and moved with a confident stride toward the house. Ethan opened the door before she could knock. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Rebecca Simmons. Frank sent me. Said you might need some help getting this place habitable." Her direct gaze and no-nonsense tone suggested she wasn't someone who wasted time on pleasantries. "Call me Ethan, and Frank didn't mention sending anyone." Rebecca shrugged. "Frank worries. Said you were determined to do everything yourself, which is admirable but stupid when it comes to old houses. I'm a structural engineer by training, contractor by necessity in a town this size. Thought I'd offer a professional assessment, no charge." Ethan hesitated only briefly. An expert opinion would be valuable, and he sensed no ulterior motive in Rebecca's straightforward manner. "I'd appreciate that," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. Rebecca moved through the house with practiced efficiency, taking notes on a small pad, occasionally tapping walls or examining joists with a flashlight she produced from her bag. "Well, the good news is the foundation is solid, and the main structural Beams are intact, she concluded after a thorough inspection. The roof needs immediate attention before the next heavy rain. Electrical is a complete redo. The wiring that remains is dangerous. Plumbing has multiple issues, but the well should be serviceable once cleaned. She handed him a rough sketch she'd made with problem areas prioritized. If I were you, I'd tackle it in this order. You can do some yourself, but for others, you'll need help, not just expertise, extra hands. I appreciate the advice, but my budget is limited, Ethan admitted. Rebecca studied him for a moment. Frank mentioned that. Look, Mapleton has a tradition called a work party. Neighbors help neighbors on big projects, roofing, barn raising, that sort of thing. In exchange, you provide food, drinks, and your labor when they need it. It's how small towns survive. The concept was foreign to Ethan, whose life in Silicon Valley had been marked by relentless self-sufficiency and professional services paid for at premium rates. "Why would anyone want to help a stranger?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "Because you won't be a stranger for long, and because this house—" She gestured around them. "This house matters to some of us." Samuel Caldwell was. She hesitated. "Important to this community. Controversial, but important." "You knew him?" Ethan asked. "I was just a kid when he disappeared, but I remember him. Tall, always had books under his arm, talked to everyone about history like it was the most exciting thing in the world." Her expression became more serious. Not everyone appreciated his enthusiasm, especially when his research started, challenging certain local families' carefully constructed narratives. "Like the Harringtons?" Ethan ventured. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "You've met William already, I take it?" "He offered to buy the place, $5,000. She snorted. "Of course he did. That's about 1/10 of what the property's worth, even in this condition. The Harringtons have been trying to get their hands on this land since before Samuel disappeared." "Why? What's so special about this farm?" Rebecca seemed to choose her words carefully. "Officially, the location is valuable, close to the river, good soil, expansive acreage. Unofficially, Samuel was convinced he'd found evidence of something. Here, something that would rewrite a chapter of American history, something that would particularly affect the Harrington family's carefully curated reputation as descendants of Revolutionary War heroes." Before Ethan could press for details, Rebecca glanced at her watch. "It's getting late. Come to the diner tomorrow morning, 6:30, like Frank said. We'll talk about organizing that work party." She headed for the door, then turned back. "And, Ethan, be careful what you say about Samuel's research around town. Some people are still sensitive about it." After Rebecca left, Ethan returned to the journal, now even more intrigued by what Samuel Caldwell might have discovered. The entries reference various historical sites, particularly one called Freeman's Farm, and something referred to as the alternate encampment. There were sketches of what appeared to be battlefield layouts, with arrows indicating troop movements and cryptic notations about the official account versus the truth. One name appeared repeatedly in the later entries, Benedict Arnold. Most Americans knew Arnold as history's most famous traitor, the Revolutionary War general who had plotted to surrender the crucial fortress at West Point to the British. But Samuel's note suggested a more complex narrative, one involving the Harrington family ancestral patriarch, General Thomas Harrington, who had fought alongside Arnold at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. As night fell, Ethan reluctantly set the journal aside. Tomorrow he would need to present himself at the diner, meet more of Mapleton's residents, and somehow determine who might be allies in his quest to uncover Samuel's secrets and who might be obstacles. The Crossroads Diner looked like it had been transported directly from the 1950s. Chrome fixtures, vinyl booths, and a counter with spinning stools. When Ethan entered at precisely 6:30 the next morning, the place was already half full, primarily, with older men occupying what were clearly their regular spots. Conversations paused briefly as heads turned to assess the newcomer, then resumed at a slightly lower volume. Frank Donovan waved from a corner booth where he sat with two other men. "Right on time," Frank said as Ethan approached. "Boys, this is Ethan Reeves, new owner of the Caldwell place. Ethan, meet Harvey Bishop, retired high school history teacher, and Carl Whitman runs the local garage." Handshakes were exchanged, and Ethan slid into the booth. A waitress appeared, almost immediately, coffee pot in hand. "You must be the California boy everyone's talking about," she said, filling a mug for Ethan without asking. Her name tag read Doris. "What'll you have?" Ethan ordered eggs and toast, conscious of maintaining his budget despite his recent windfall. "So," Harvey said once Doris had left, "I understand you're planning to restore Samuel's place." "Ambitious project. Rebecca Simmons gave me a rundown of what needs doing," Ethan replied. "It's extensive, but she mentioned something about a work party tradition." The three men exchanged glances. "Rebecca's right," Frank said. "It's how things get done around here. But you should know, taking help means joining the community. It's not a transaction, it's a relationship." "What Frank's trying to say," Carl interjected, "is that some folks might be hesitant to help with the Caldwell place given its history, and they'll want to know if you're planning to stay or if you're just fixing it up to flip it." The question caught Ethan off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Was he planning to stay in Mapleton permanently? A week ago, he couldn't have imagined living anywhere but California. Now, "I'm not flipping it," he said finally. "Beyond that, I'm still figuring things out. But I respect the history of the place, and I want to do right by it." Harvey studied him intently. "Have you found any of Samuel's research materials? His papers, journals, that sort of thing?" The question seemed casual, but Ethan sensed an underlying intensity. He remembered Rebecca's warning about being careful what he shared. "Some old books, farming records," he said vaguely. "Nothing. That made much sense to me. Why do you ask?" "Professional interest," Harvey replied. "As a history teacher, I always found Samuel's theories fascinating, if controversial. He believed that certain events during the Revolutionary War, particularly the Saratoga campaign, had been deliberately misrepresented in historical records. Dangerous theories to pursue in a town where the Harrington family considers themselves American royalty," Carl added with a snort. "Now, Carl," Frank cautioned, "we don't know that the Harringtons had anything to do with Samuel's disappearance." "Don't we?" Carl countered. "Martin Harrington threatened Samuel publicly at the town meeting just a week before he vanished. Called him a delusional old man spreading slander against patriots, and now his son William has been trying to get that land for decades." Ethan absorbed this information, connecting it with what he'd read in Samuel's journal. The journal mentioned a Martin Harrington as part of something called the Fellowship. Was that William's father? The three men went silent, exchanging meaningful glances. Finally, Harvey spoke. The fellowship began as a historical research group in the early 1960s. 5 men, Samuel Caldwell, Martin Harrington, Richard Thompson, James Whitaker, and Benjamin Chen. They were investigating what they believed were inaccuracies in the recorded history of the Revolutionary War, particularly events surrounding the Saratoga campaign. "What happened to them?" Ethan asked. "They had a falling out," Frank said carefully. By the late 1970s, only Samuel was still actively pursuing the research. Martin Harrington had become his most vocal opponent. And the others? Thompson moved away. Whitaker died in a car accident in '75. And Chen, well, no one's quite sure what happened to Benjamin Chen. He was a professor from Boston, only came up occasionally for research. Ethan filed away the name Benjamin. Chen, wondering if there might be a connection he could pursue. The conversation shifted to more practical matters. Who in town might join a work party, what materials would be needed, and how to organize the effort. By the time breakfast ended, Ethan had a list of names. A tentative date for the first workday focused on roof repairs and a clearer sense of the complex social dynamics in Mapleton. There were those who remembered Samuel fondly and seemed genuinely interested in seeing his property restored. Others, aligned with the Harrington family interests, were described as best avoided. As the group dispersed, Harvey lingered. "I'd be interested in seeing Samuel's house," he said casually, "for old time's sake. I visited him there often back in the day." Ethan hesitated, unsure whether to trust the former history teacher. "Maybe in a few days, once I've cleared more of the debris." Harvey nodded, seemingly unperturbed by the deflection. "Of course. And if you do come across any of his research materials, I'd be happy to help make sense of them. Samuel and I didn't always agree, but I respected his commitment to historical truth, wherever it led." Back at the farm, Ethan began the day's work with renewed energy. The interactions at the diner had given him a better sense of Mapleton's dynamics, and the promise of help with major repairs lifted a weight from his shoulders. Still, questions lingered about Samuel's research, the mysterious fellowship, and the true reason for the Harringtons' interest in the property. As Ethan cleared debris from what had once been Samuel's study, he found a hidden panel behind a bookcase, a small cavity in the wall that contained a leather portfolio. Inside were more photographs of the fellowship members at various historical sites, detailed maps of the Saratoga battlefield, and handwritten letters between Samuel and Benjamin Chen discussing their findings. One letter, dated 1979, particularly caught Ethan's attention. "Samuel, the documents I've uncovered in the Massachusetts Historical Society confirm our suspicions. General Thomas Harrington's personal correspondence contradicts his public account. Of Oct. 7, 1777, he was not with Gates at the command post as officially reported. He was with Arnold at the critical breakthrough. The implications are staggering, not only for our understanding of how the battle was won, but for the subsequent events that led to Arnold's fateful decision 2 years later. The Harrington family fortune was built on a foundation of strategic, historical omission. No wonder Martin reacts so violently to our research. We must proceed with caution. Ben." The letter confirmed what Ethan had begun to suspect. Samuel had been researching something that threatened the Harrington family's historical reputation and possibly the legitimacy of their wealth and status. But how did this connect to the map mentioned in Samuel's final journal entry, and what had happened to Benjamin Chen? As Ethan contemplated these questions, he heard a vehicle approaching. Through the window, he saw William Harrington's black SUV coming up the drive. Quickly, he tucked the portfolio behind a stack of books and went to meet his uninvited visitor. William stepped out of his vehicle, surveying the property with an appraising eye. "Mr. Reeves, I see you've begun clearing the place. Having second thoughts yet about the scale of the project?" "Actually, I'm more committed than ever," Ethan replied evenly. "The community has been very supportive. We're organizing a work party for the roof repairs next week." A flash of annoyance crossed William's face, quickly masked by his practiced smile. "How quaint. Though I wonder if you realize what you're getting yourself into. Old houses like this can hide all sorts of unpleasant surprises. Structural issues, hazardous materials, historical complications." The emphasis on the last words wasn't subtle. "I'm finding the history fascinating," Ethan said carefully. "Samuel Caldwell seems to have been quite the local character." William's expression hardened slightly. Caldwell was a disturbed old man who became obsessed with conspiracy theories in his final years. Unfortunately, he managed to convince some impressionable locals of his delusions. "Delusions about what, exactly?" Ethan asked innocently. "Ancient history, misinterpretations of Revolutionary War events, nothing of relevance today." William waved a dismissive hand. "My concern is that you might waste considerable resources restoring this property based on romantic notions about its past, only to discover that the practical challenges are insurmountable." "I appreciate your concern," Ethan said, not bothering to mask the sarcasm in his tone, "but I think I'll take my chances." William studied him for a long moment. "My father always said that Samuel Caldwell's greatest flaw was his stubborn refusal to recognize when he was outmatched. I hope you're more adaptable." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "My offer still stands, $5,000, but only until the end of the week. After that, I suspect you'll find this community less welcoming than it initially appears." As William drove away, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the threat had been more than theoretical. Whatever Samuel had discovered about the Harrington family's past, it was valuable enough that even decades later they were determined to control access to it. That evening, as dusk settled over the farm, Ethan was startled by a soft knock at the back door. When he opened it, Rebecca Simmons stood there, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I saw Harrington's car here earlier," she said without preamble. "What did he want?" "Same as before, trying to buy the place, but with more thinly veiled threats this time." Rebecca nodded as if this confirmed her expectations. "Listen, there's something you should know. Harrington's been asking questions around town. Specifically, whether you found any of Samuel's research materials. He's offering rewards for information." "Why tell me this?" Ethan asked, studying her face in the fading light. "Because my grandfather was Richard Thompson, one of the fellowship members. He left Mapleton after Samuel disappeared, convinced that what happened wasn't an accident. Before he died, he made me promise that if anyone ever seriously took up Samuel's work again, I'd help them." She met Ethan's gaze directly. "Have you found it yet? The map Samuel mentioned in his final journal entry?" The direct question caught Ethan off guard. "You know about the journal?" Grandpa had copies of some entries. Samuel suspected he was being watched toward the end, so he shared key information with my grandfather for safekeeping. She lowered her voice. The map isn't a physical map of land. It's a map to the truth about what happened at Freeman's farm in 1777. A truth that would devastate the Harrington family's historical legacy and possibly their claim to certain properties, including parts of this farm. Ethan considered his next words carefully. Samuel's final entry said the map is where memory lives but decay cannot touch. Any idea what that means? Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. No. But I know someone who might. Benjamin Chen's granddaughter. She's a professor at the University of Vermont. Her name is Mia Chen. The name sent a jolt through Ethan. Another descendant, another connection to the fellowship. How do I find her? I can arrange a meeting, but it needs to be discreet. William Harrington has connections everywhere. She checked her watch. I need to go before someone notices my truck here. The work party is still on for Saturday. 10 people have committed to help with the roof. Use that as cover to continue your search. Samuel was methodical. If he hid something important, there will be a system to finding it. As Rebecca slipped away into the gathering darkness, Ethan felt a surge of determination unlike anything he'd experienced since before his business collapsed. This wasn't just about restoring an old house anymore. It was about uncovering a truth that had been deliberately buried, a truth someone was still actively trying to suppress. For the first time in months, he had a purpose that transcended mere survival. Whatever Samuel Caldwell had discovered, whatever the map revealed, Ethan was now committed to bringing it to light. Not just for his own sake, but for Samuel's memory and for the historical record itself. Standing in the doorway of the old farmhouse, watching the first stars appear in the Vermont sky, Ethan realized that his desperate $500 gamble might turn out to be the most important decision of his life. The journey that had begun in failure and desperation was evolving into something he hadn't anticipated. A quest for truth, a connection to a community, and perhaps a chance to make history rather than just study it. The Saturday work party exceeded all of Ethan's expectations. By dawn, trucks and cars began arriving, bringing over a dozen Mapleton residents armed with tools, ladders, and boundless energy. Frank had organized everything, assigning people to different tasks based on their skills: roofing team, structural, repair crew, yard clearing squad. Someone brought a portable generator to power tools, while others set up folding tables laden with food and coolers of drinks. This is overwhelming, Ethan confessed to Frank as they watched the organized chaos unfold. I didn't expect so many people. Frank chuckled. Told you, work parties are a tradition. Besides, folks have been curious about this place for years. Chance to see inside is as good as currency around here. Throughout the morning, Ethan moved between groups, learning techniques, holding lumber, passing tools, and gradually getting to know his neighbors. The conversations were casual, but he noticed how people occasionally steered topics toward Samuel Caldwell or the property's history, fishing for information about what Ethan might have found. By midday, the most critical section of roof had been replaced, several broken windows repaired, and the overgrown yard around the immediate house cleared. The transformation was remarkable, not just in the property, but in Ethan's connection to it. Working alongside these people, hearing their stories about the town and the farm's history, he felt increasingly invested in the place and increasingly determined to uncover its secrets. During lunch, Rebecca pulled him aside, speaking quietly amid the general noise of conversation. Mia Chen agreed to meet you. Monday noon at the University Library in Burlington. Said she's been waiting for someone to continue her grandfather's work. Ethan nodded, conscious of keeping his reaction neutral as others glanced their way. I appreciate everyone's help today, more than I can express. Save your gratitude for when the next big storm hits and your roof doesn't leak, Rebecca replied with a small smile. Oh, and William Harrington has been asking questions around town about you, your background, why you came here. Thought you should know. The work continued through the afternoon, and by sunset the farmhouse had undergone a remarkable transformation. The roof no longer threatened to collapse, the yard was navigable, and the porch had been stabilized. Inside, Frank's nephew Jake had managed to get basic plumbing functioning again, providing cold running water to the kitchen sink, a luxury Ethan hadn't expected for weeks. As people began to leave, Ethan thanked them individually, already, mentally planning how he would repay their generosity when their own projects needed assistance. The concept of community interdependence, so foreign to his Silicon Valley mindset, was beginning to make profound sense. Harvey Bishop, the retired history teacher, was among the last to leave. He had spent most of the day helping with later tasks, and Ethan had noticed his curious glances toward the house's interior. Remarkable progress, Harvey commented, looking back at the house. Samuel would be pleased to see the old place coming back to life. He hesitated, then added more quietly, If you've found any of his research materials, I'd be happy to help you interpret them. I followed his work closely over the years. Ethan maintained a neutral expression. I'll keep that in mind if I come across anything substantial. Harvey studied him for a moment. Just be careful who you trust with whatever you find. Not everyone in Mapleton values historical truth over comfortable narratives. After everyone had gone, Ethan stood on the porch, watching the last streaks of sunset fade from the sky. The day's work had transformed not just the farm, but something in himself. For months after his company's collapse, he had withdrawn, licking his wounds in solitude, believing his failure was his burden alone to bear. Today had shown him another way, the power of shared purpose, of hands joined in common effort. Sunday was quieter, giving Ethan time to continue sorting through Samuel's possessions. In what had once been a home office, he found boxes of historical documents, photocopies from various archives, handwritten notes and maps with Samuel's annotations. Most pertained to the Battle of Saratoga and Benedict Arnold's controversial role in the American victory there. One document particularly caught Ethan's attention. A photocopy of a letter from General Horatio Gates to the Continental Congress, dated October 1777, with Samuel's notes scrawled in the margins. Official account contradicts eyewitness testimony. Compare with Harrington's private correspondence claiming credit for victory plan actually conceived by Arnold. The historical dispute seemed arcane, yet Samuel had believed it important enough to risk his safety, perhaps even his life. What was Ethan missing? Monday morning, Ethan drove to Burlington, arriving at the University Library early. He spent the time researching Benedict Arnold on his laptop, trying to better understand the historical context of Samuel's obsession. Beyond the standard narrative of Arnold as America's most infamous traitor, he found scholarly articles suggesting a more complex figure, a brilliant military tactician whose contributions to the revolutionary cause had been deliberately minimized. After his betrayal, At precisely noon, a young woman approached his table. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with straight black hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing professorial attire, blazer over a blouse, dark-framed glasses, and an expression of guarded interest. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Mia Chen. Rebecca Simmons said you wanted to meet me." Ethan stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to this. I understand your grandfather was Benjamin Chen." Mia nodded, sitting across from him. "One of the original fellowship members. He was a history professor here, specializing in Revolutionary War studies." Her direct gaze was assessing. "Rebecca said you've purchased Samuel Caldwell's farm and found some of his research materials." "Yes, including his journal. The final entry mentions a map hidden where memory lives but decay cannot touch. I was hoping you might have insight into what that means." Mia's expression shifted subtly. "My grandfather never fully explained his involvement with the fellowship to me. He became reluctant to discuss it after Samuel disappeared. But he did leave a sealed letter with instructions that it should only be opened by someone who came asking specifically about the map." She studied Ethan carefully. "I've had that letter for 15 years, waiting." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine at the revelation. "What does it say?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it." She reached into her bag and produced an aged envelope, yellowed with time, sealed with wax. "Grandfather was very specific. It was only to be opened by the person who found Samuel's journal and asked about the map." The envelope felt surprisingly heavy in Ethan's hands. The wax seal bore an impression, a compass rose design that matched a symbol he'd seen in Samuel's journal. "Before you open it," Mia said, "you should understand what you're potentially getting involved with. The fellowship wasn't just a group of history enthusiasts. They believed they had discovered evidence that would fundamentally change our understanding of a critical moment in American history, and specifically, evidence that would undermine the heroic narrative the Harrington family had constructed about their ancestors' role in the Revolution. "General Thomas Harrington," Ethan supplied. "Samuel's notes suggest he took credit for actions actually performed by Benedict Arnold at Saratoga." Mia nodded, impressed. "You've done some research." "Yes, but it goes deeper. The Harrington family fortune, which still powers their influence today, was built on land grants received for Thomas Harrington's supposed heroism. If evidence emerged that those grants were obtained through historical fraud, the modern Harringtons could lose their claim to significant assets," Ethan finished, "including, potentially, parts of the Caldwell farm." "Exactly. This isn't just academic history. It's about power, wealth, and identity." Mia glanced around the library. "William Harrington sits on the university's board of trustees. His family has donated millions to this institution. Even discussing this research can have real-world consequences." Ethan considered this, turning the envelope in his hands. "Yet your grandfather wanted this information preserved, waiting for the right time." "My grandfather believed in historical truth above all else. So did Samuel." Mia's expression was solemn. "Whatever is in that envelope, it's part of a quest they were willing to risk everything for. The question is, are you?" Without hesitation, Ethan broke the seal. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper and a small memory card, the kind used in digital cameras in the early 2000s. The note, was brief to the finder of Samuel's journal. If you're reading this, you've discovered what Samuel and I worked decades to uncover, evidence of historical manipulation that has benefited the Harrington family for generations. Samuel believed the most crucial evidence should be preserved digitally. Where memory lives but decay cannot touch. Judo. On this card, you will find photographs of documents from the Massachusetts Historical Society and the National Archives that Samuel and I secretly digitized before the originals were permanently archived, read, buried at the Harrington family's request. Most importantly, you'll find the true map of the Saratoga battlefield from October 7th, 1777, showing Benedict Arnold's actual movements and Thomas Harrington's position far from the action he later claimed to lead. This map, combined with the contemporaneous accounts we discovered, proves that Thomas Harrington's heroic narrative was fabricated after Arnold's fall from grace provided a convenient opportunity. The physical evidence, the original map, and letters was hidden by Samuel at the place where it all began. He believed the evidence should remain intact for future historians. Be careful. The Harringtons destroyed Samuel's reputation when he threatened to publish. They may have done worse. Truth matters, even centuries later. Benjamin Chen, 2005. Ethan looked up at Mia, who was watching him intently. It's a memory card. Digital. Copies of historical documents, he explained. Your grandfather says it proves the Harrington family narrative about their ancestor is false. Mia didn't seem surprised. My grandfather was methodical. He would have created backups. She hesitated. There's a computer in my office where we can view the contents. If you're willing to trust me that far. The decision was easy. Lead the way. Mia's office was in the history department, a small space lined with books and historical maps. She inserted the memory card into her computer, and they both leaned forward as a folder of files appeared on the screen. Dozens of image files with dates from the Revolutionary period. The documents were remarkable, letters between Continental Army officers describing the Battle of Saratoga in terms that clearly showed Benedict Arnold, not Thomas Harrington, leading the critical charge that turned the tide of battle. There were maps with officer positions marked, journal entries from soldiers who had witnessed the action, and most damning private correspondence from Thomas Harrington himself, written years later, acknowledging that he had adjusted certain details of the historical record to better serve the new nation's need for unblemished heroes. This is extraordinary, Mia whispered, her academic mind clearly processing the historical significance. With these sources, we could rewrite the accepted narrative of a pivotal Revolutionary War battle and potentially undermine the Harrington family's claim to lands granted based on Thomas's supposed heroism, Ethan added. The last file on the card was a photograph of an old map, hand-drawn, yellowed with age, showing the Saratoga battlefield with troop positions carefully marked. Arrows indicated Arnold's movement directly into the British line, while Thomas Harrington's position was clearly marked at the rear with the reserve forces. This must be the original map Samuel hid, Ethan said. The physical evidence Benjamin mentioned. According to this note, it's hidden at the place where it all began. Freeman's Farm, Mia supplied immediately. The first engagement of the Saratoga campaign happened at Freeman's Farm on September 19, 1777. The decisive battle that everyone remembers was on October 7th, but it all began at Freeman's Farm. Ethan remembered seeing that name in Samuel's journal. Is Freeman's farm still around? Could Samuel have hidden something there? Mia shook her head. The original Freeman farmhouse is long gone, but she paused, thinking. There's a small museum on the battlefield site now. Samuel was involved with its establishment in the 1960s. He helped design some of the exhibits. The implication was clear. What better place to hide historical evidence than in a historical museum? It would be protected, preserved, yet hidden in plain sight. We need to go there, Ethan said decisively. It's about a 4-hour drive from Mapleton, Mia warned, and we don't know exactly what we're looking for or where in the museum it might be hidden. Your grandfather believed Samuel hid physical evidence that could conclusively prove historical manipulation, evidence the Harringtons have been trying to suppress for generations. That's worth a road trip. Ethan felt a surge of determination. Can you get away? Tomorrow? Mia considered briefly, then nodded. I don't have classes on Tuesdays. I could meet you in Mapleton early morning, and we could drive together. As they made arrangements, Ethan felt a growing sense that he had stumbled into something far larger than a simple property purchase. What had begun as a desperate last chance with his final $500 was evolving into a historical treasure hunt with real-world implications. For the first time since his business failed, he felt the excitement of purpose, of meaning beyond mere survival. Driving back to Mapleton that afternoon, Ethan was so preoccupied with thoughts of the Freeman's Farm Museum that he almost missed the black SUV parked near his driveway. He slowed, recognizing William Harrington's vehicle with a jolt of concern. What was he doing here? Ethan parked beside the SUV, but found it empty. Moving cautiously toward the house, he noticed the front door was ajar. He had definitely locked it before leaving. Inside, he found William Harrington casually examining. The contents of Samuel's desk, drawers pulled open, papers spread across the surface. Breaking and entering is a crime even in small towns, Ethan said from the doorway. William turned, not appearing particularly concerned at being caught. Ah, Mr. Reeves, I was hoping to catch you at home. When I found the door unlocked, I thought I'd wait inside. The lie was delivered smoothly, without a hint of embarrassment. The door wasn't unlocked, Ethan replied coldly. What are you doing here? William set down the paper he'd been examining. I understand you've been asking questions around town about Samuel Caldwell's research, even meeting with people connected to his old associates. His tone remained conversational, but there was steel beneath it. I thought we should have a frank discussion about what you think you're looking for. I'm not looking for anything except to restore this property, Ethan said, moving into the room, positioning himself between William and the desk. Come now, Mr. Reeves. We're both intelligent men. You found Samuel's journals, possibly other materials. You're researching the Saratoga campaign and my ancestors' role in it. William's smile never reached his eyes. Let me be direct. That research led Samuel Caldwell down a self-destructive path. I'd hate to see history repeat itself. The threat was thinly veiled, but Ethan refused to be intimidated. Is that what happened to Samuel? Self-destruction? Because the town rumors suggest something else entirely. William's expression hardened. Small towns breed small minds and wild imaginations. Samuel was an elderly man with dementia who wandered into the woods during a snowstorm. Tragic, but entirely explicable. He straightened his jacket. Whatever you think you're uncovering, Mr. Reeves, I can assure you it's not worth the trouble it will bring. History is best left to rest." "Is that what your father told Samuel before he disappeared?" Ethan challenged, anger overriding caution. Something dangerous flashed in William's eyes. "You're overstepping, Mr. Reeves. My father was a respected community leader who tried to help Samuel when his mental health deteriorated. The fact that Samuel became paranoid and accused him of threats says more about Samuel's condition than my father's actions." William moved toward the door, then paused. "My offer to purchase this property still stands. In fact, I'm willing to increase it to $10,000. A generous return on your investment, I think you'd agree. But the offer expires today." "Not interested," Ethan said firmly. "Pity." William studied him for a moment. "You know, I looked into your background after our first meeting. Failed tech entrepreneur, personal bankruptcy, living out of your car, a desperate man making one last desperate gamble." His tone became almost sympathetic. "I understand the need to believe you found something valuable here, something that might restore what you've lost. But chasing Samuel's delusions won't rebuild your life, Mr. Reeves. It might cost you what little you have left." After William left, Ethan did a careful inventory of Samuel's papers. Nothing seemed to be missing, but he couldn't be certain. What William might have photographed or memorized. The encounter left him shaken, but more determined than ever. William's increasingly aggressive efforts to suppress Samuel's research only reinforced its likely legitimacy. That evening, Ethan called Rebecca to warn her about William's visit, and to let her know about the planned trip to Freeman's farm with Mia Chen. Rebecca listened carefully, then said, "Be careful on that drive. The road to the battlefield site can be tricky, isolated stretches, poor cell service, and if William knows you're pursuing this—" She didn't need to finish the thought. "We'll be careful," Ethan promised. "But I need to see this through. What Samuel discovered, it matters, not just for historical accuracy, but for justice." "Samuel would be proud to hear you say that," Rebecca said softly. "He always believed the truth would find its champion eventually." After a pause, she added, "Take my truck tomorrow. It's more reliable for longer drives, and William won't recognize it. I'll drop it off early and get a ride back with Frank." Ethan spent the rest of the evening studying the digital files from Benjamin Chen's memory card, making notes about specific details they should look for at the museum. The evidence was compelling. The accounts of Arnold's heroism at Saratoga were consistent across multiple independent sources, while Thomas Harrington's self-aggrandizing narrative only emerged after Arnold's treachery had made him a pariah, whose contributions were being systematically erased from the historical record. The opportunism was clear. Harrington had claimed credit for actions performed by a man who could no longer defend his military record, leveraging that false narrative into land grants, political appointments, and eventually the family fortune that still powered the Harringtons' influence generations later. As Ethan prepared for bed, he found himself reflecting on the parallels to his own situation. He had come to Mapleton as a failure, a cautionary tale of entrepreneurial hubris. Yet here, in this abandoned farmhouse purchased with his last dollars, he had found not just money, but purpose. The journey to rebuild the farm was simultaneously rebuilding him, teaching him about community, persistence, and the value of fighting for truth, not just success. Whatever happened tomorrow at Freeman's farm, Ethan realized he was already a different man than the one who had arrived a week ago. His definition of wealth had expanded beyond bank accounts to include connections, purpose, and the satisfaction of meaningful work. The old Ethan had measured himself by his company's valuation. The new Ethan was beginning to measure himself by his impact on a community and his commitment to uncovering long-buried truths. Dawn brought Rebecca with her promised truck, a well-maintained Ford F-150 that had seen its share of Vermont winters, but still ran beautifully. Mia arrived shortly after, dressed practically for the day's expedition in jeans and a light jacket, a notebook tucked under her arm. "William Harrington called the department chair yesterday," she informed Ethan as they prepared to leave, "asking about my research focuses, whether I was working on anything related to Saratoga or the Revolutionary War in this region." "Are you concerned?" Ethan asked, loading their day packs into the truck. Mia's expression was resolute, academic. Freedom still means something, even with major donors. Besides, my tenure review isn't for another 2 years. By then, if we find what Samuel hid, the evidence will speak for itself. The drive to the Saratoga battlefield took them through stunning Vermont and New York countryside, rolling hills, giving way to farmland, small towns appearing and disappearing as they made their way south. They used the time to strategize their approach, reviewing what they knew about the museum from its website. The Freeman's Farm site has a small visitor center with exhibits about the battle, Mia explained. Samuel helped design the original. Displays in the late 1960s, which coincides with the height of the Fellowship's research activities. If he hid something there, it would likely be incorporated into an exhibit in a way that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers, but would still be there 50 years later, Ethan mused. That's assuming the exhibits haven't been completely redesigned since then. Historical sites often keep original exhibits for decades, especially smaller ones with limited budgets, Mia said. And Samuel was clever. He would have created something that would appear to be a legitimate part of the display. They arrived at the Saratoga National Historical Park shortly after noon. The battlefield preservation encompassed thousands of acres, but the Freeman's Farm area was clearly marked, with interpretive signs explaining its significance in the First Battle of Saratoga. The visitor center was a modest building housing exhibits on the campaign, including dioramas of the battlefield, historical artifacts, and informational panels. As they entered, Ethan felt a surge of anticipation. Somewhere in this unassuming space could be the physical evidence that Samuel Caldwell had given his life to protect. They moved systematically through the exhibits, paying special attention to those that mentioned Benedict Arnold or showed maps of the October 7th battle. In the center of the main room stood a large diorama of the battlefield, a detailed scale model showing the terrain and troop positions. Mia studied it intently. "This looks original to the 1960s, she whispered to Ethan. "See the craftsmanship. Modern exhibits use different materials." Ethan circled the display, noticing a small brass plaque on one side. Battlefield Diorama, created by S. Caldwell, R. Thompson, and B. Chen, 1967. The Fellowship members had built this very model. Looking more closely at the diorama, Ethan noticed something odd about a small structure representing the Freeman farmhouse. It appeared to have a slightly different construction than the other buildings in the model. While most were simply painted wooden blocks, this one seemed to have more detail, almost as if... "Mia," he whispered, pointing discreetly, "Look at the farmhouse model. I think it might open." They glanced around to ensure no other visitors or staff were watching, then Mia gently pressed on the tiny structure. With a barely audible click, the roof lifted, revealing a small cavity within the model farmhouse. Inside was a carefully folded piece of aged parchment. Ethan's heart raced as Mia carefully extracted it, concealing it in her notebook. "We should examine this elsewhere," she murmured. They finished touring the exhibits, maintaining casual conversation for the benefit of the park ranger stationed at the information desk, then returned to the parking lot. Once inside the truck, Mia carefully unfolded the parchment. It was the original map they had seen in digital form, a detailed rendering of the Saratoga battlefield with troop positions marked in faded ink. But this version had additional elements not visible in the photograph, notations in the margins, written in what appeared to be code, and most significantly, the signatures of 5 witnesses who had attested to its accuracy, dated October 1777. "This is it," Mia breathed, her academic training clearly helping her appreciate the document's significance. A contemporaneous battlefield map with witness signatures, clearly showing Arnold leading the charge while Harrington remained with the reserves. This directly contradicts the official account Harrington later provided, claiming he led the decisive action. Accompanying the map was a folded letter, brittle with age, but still legible. As Mia carefully opened it, they realized it was written by Benedict Arnold himself, dated 1780, after his defection to the British. It was addressed to a former aide, defending his military record. And as for Saratoga, which some now claim I played no role in, I leave it to honest men who were present to attest that it was I who led the charge against Brayman's redoubt, while others, including Harrington, who now claims the glory, remained safely behind. Such is the nature of fortune's wheel, that a man's deeds may be claimed by others once he has fallen from favor. "This is primary source evidence," Mia said, her voice trembling slightly with academic excitement. Arnold's own words, written when he had no reason to lie about this specific detail, combined with the map and the witness signatures. She looked at Ethan. "This is what Samuel and my grandfather were protecting, evidence that Thomas Harrington's heroic narrative, the foundation of the family's initial wealth and status, was a deliberate historical fraud." As they carefully repackaged the fragile documents, Ethan felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Samuel hid these where they would be protected as historical artifacts, yet concealed from those who would destroy them. Brilliant. And he ensured that eventually someone would find his journal, follow the clues, and complete the work he started, Mia added. That someone turned out to be you, Ethan. Driving back toward Mapleton, they discussed how best to proceed with their discovery. Simply publishing the findings could expose them to the same dangers Samuel had faced, yet the truth deserved to be known. "We need to create multiple copies," Mia decided, "digital and physical. Deposit them with different trusted individuals and institutions. Make it impossible to suppress the information again." Ethan agreed. "And we need leverage against any potential retaliation from William Harrington." As they drove through the Vermont countryside, the setting sun casting long shadows across the rolling hills, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A failed entrepreneur with his last $500 had purchased an abandoned farm out of desperation, only to become the keeper of a historical truth that powerful interests had suppressed for generations. The irony wasn't lost on him. In Silicon Valley, he had chased innovation and disruption, believing he was building something new and important. Yet here, in rural Vermont, he had found a more profound purpose in preserving the past and ensuring long-deferred justice. Whatever challenges lay ahead in confronting the Harrington family with the truth, Ethan knew he had already gained something invaluable. The knowledge that rock bottom could be a foundation, not just an ending. His greatest failure had led him, improbably, to his most meaningful work. As Mapleton appeared on the horizon, Ethan made a silent promise to Samuel Caldwell, wherever he might be. The truth the old historian had given his life to protect would finally see the light of day, and the farm he had loved would live again, a testament to the power of perseverance and the endless possibility of new beginnings. As Ethan and Mia drove back toward Mapleton, the sunset painted the Vermont mountains in hues of gold and amber. The documents safely tucked in Mia's archival folder represented more than just historical evidence. They were the culmination of a decades-long quest for truth that had cost Samuel Caldwell his life and driven the fellowship apart. "We need to be strategic about this," Mia said, breaking the contemplative silence. "William Harrington won't simply concede when presented with evidence that his family's fortune was built on historical fraud." Ethan nodded, eyes on the winding road ahead. "We need to create multiple copies, secure them in different locations, and then consider the best way to make this public. I have colleagues at other universities who specialize in Revolutionary War history, people with impeccable academic credentials who could authenticate these documents and vouch for their significance," Mia offered. "Once authenticated, it would be much harder for William to suppress the information." The plan made sense, but Ethan couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. William had already demonstrated he was willing to break into the farmhouse. How far would he go to protect his family's legacy and fortune? As they rounded a bend in the road, Ethan spotted a vehicle parked across both lanes. A black SUV identical to William's, positioned to block their path. He hit the brakes, slowing Rebecca's truck to a stop 50 yards from the obstruction. "That's not an accident," Mia observed tensely. Through the gathering dusk, they could see a figure standing beside the SUV, arms crossed, waiting. "William," Ethan confirmed, recognizing the posture even at this distance. He must have been watching the museum or had someone watching it for him. Mia clutched the folder containing the documents. "What do we do?" Ethan considered their options. Turning around would only delay the inevitable confrontation, and there was no cell service in this remote stretch to call for help. Sometimes the only way forward was through. "We talk to him," Ethan decided, "but we keep the engine running and don't get out of the truck. And if things seem dangerous, we leave, even if it means going off-road." As they cautiously approached, William stepped forward, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Ethan stopped the truck, a safe distance away, and lowered his window partway. "Blocking a public road is illegal, William," he called out, "not to mention dangerous." William approached, stopping a few feet from the driver's side. "I thought we might have a private conversation, away from curious ears in Mapleton." His tone was conversational, but his eyes were hard as flint. I understand you and Professor Chen have been visiting the Saratoga battlefield today. Find anything interesting? Just tourists, Ethan replied evenly. Mia's been helping me understand the historical context of the area, given the farm's connections. William's smile never reached his eyes. You know what amazes me about historians, Mr. Reeves? Their ability to construct elaborate narratives from fragmentary evidence, to build entire theories on the shakiest of foundations. He glanced meaningfully at Mia. All too often, academic careers are built on challenging established historical accounts regardless of the real-world consequences. Truth has consequences, Mia replied, meeting his gaze steadily. That's what makes it powerful. Truth, William repeated as if tasting the word, a subjective concept at best. What my ancestor wrote about his experiences at Saratoga was his truth. The land grants he received were legally bestowed by a grateful nation. The subsequent generations of my family who built businesses, employed thousands, and contributed to their communities, that legacy is built on solid ground, not academic quibbles about battlefield positions 2 centuries ago. If it's all just academic quibbles, why are you blocking our road? Ethan asked pointedly. William studied him for a long moment. Because I recognize the look of a man who thinks he's found something valuable. I saw it in Samuel Caldwell's eyes before his unfortunate disappearance. I'm here to save you from his fate. The threat hung in the air between them. Ethan felt Mia tense beside him. Is that a confession? Ethan asked quietly. To what happened to Samuel? William's expression hardened. It's a reality check. Samuel was an old man with dementia who wandered into the woods during a snowstorm. A tragic accident, but one could argue he put himself at risk through his obsessive behavior, his refusal to let go of historical minutiae, better left unexplored. He paused. Don't repeat his mistakes. Move your vehicle, William, Ethan said firmly. We have nothing more to discuss. Actually, we do. William reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. One final offer for the Caldwell property, $50,000. 10 times what you've spent on renovations so far, based on what I've heard from suppliers in town. You can start fresh somewhere else without the burden of Samuel's obsessions. The sum was substantial, enough to give Ethan a genuine new start anywhere in the country. For a brief moment, he felt the tug of temptation. Wasn't this what he had wanted when he first arrived? A financial recovery, a chance to rebuild. But Ethan wasn't the same man who had driven into Mapleton with his last $500 and a car full of disappointing memories. The past week had transformed him, connecting him to a community, a purpose, and principles worth more than money. The farm isn't for sale, Ethan stated with quiet conviction. Not at any price. William's expression darkened. You disappoint me, Mr. Reeves. I thought a businessman would understand practical negotiations. He stepped back from the truck. Remember this moment, when what comes next unfolds. Remember you chose this path. With that, he returned to his SUV, started the engine, and slowly pulled to the side, clearing just enough space for them to pass. Ethan drove through the gap cautiously, watching William in the rearview mirror until the SUV disappeared around a bend. That was an explicit threat, Mia said when they were well clear. We should report this to the authorities. On what grounds? Ethan asked pragmatically. He made no specific threat, and it would be our word against his, a newcomer and an academic, versus the most influential man in the county. Mia sighed, acknowledging the reality. Then we need to move quickly to secure the evidence and build support. Academic authentication first, then strategic media coverage from multiple outlets simultaneously so it can't be easily suppressed. The drive back to Mapleton became a strategy session, with Mia calling academic colleagues to email supporting documentation and Catherine coordinating with her photographer to meet them at the town hall. Rebecca joined the call, promising to bring her grandfather's attorney, who had been reviewing the land claim implications. As they drove, Ethan reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. Just weeks ago, he had been at his lowest point, homeless, nearly penniless, his confidence shattered by business failure. Now he was leading a coalition, dedicated to historical truth and justice, drawing on inner resources he hadn't known he possessed. The transformation wasn't about the money he'd found in Samuel's attic, though that had certainly helped with practical matters. It was about finding purpose beyond personal success, connection beyond professional networking, and courage beyond entrepreneurial risk-taking. The Mapleton Town Hall came into view, a white clapboard building with a clock tower, straight from a New England postcard. The small parking lot was filled, with additional cars lining the street. Inside, every seat in the meeting room was taken, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. William Harrington stood at the front, beside the county commissioner's desk, in the middle of what appeared to be an impassioned speech about preserving our authentic historical heritage. He faltered momentarily when he saw Ethan and Mia enter, but quickly recovered, concluding, "Which is why this emergency preservation order is not just appropriate but essential." Commissioner Davis, a practical-looking woman in her 60s, glanced up at Ethan. "Mr. Reeves, since you're the property owner in question, would you like to respond to Mr. Harrington's petition?" Ethan moved to the front of the room, feeling the weight of all eyes upon him. This wasn't the carefully orchestrated media rollout they had planned, but perhaps it was better, more authentic, more connected to the community that had welcomed him and helped him rebuild. "Thank you, Commissioner. I came to Mapleton just a few weeks ago, purchasing the old Caldwell farm with my last $500, looking for nothing more than a roof over my head and a chance to start over." Ethan paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Frank, Rebecca, other neighbors who had helped with the work party. What I found instead was a community that welcomed a stranger, that valued rebuilding over abandonment, and that honored its history through honest remembrance, not sanitized narratives. He turned slightly toward William. "I also found evidence that Samuel Caldwell had discovered something important, something that powerful interests have been trying to suppress for generations." A murmur ran through the crowd. William's face had gone rigid with barely controlled anger. With the help of Professor Mia Chen, granddaughter of one of Samuel's fellow researchers, we located documents that Samuel hid for safekeeping, original Revolutionary War-era evidence that directly contradicts the historical account that the Harrington family has promoted for generations. Ethan gestured to Mia, who stepped forward with the folder containing copies of the authenticated documents, which were distributed to the commissioner and key town officials. These materials, authenticated by multiple independent experts, reveal that General Thomas Harrington was not the hero of the critical moment at Saratoga as officially claimed. That role belonged to Benedict Arnold, whose contributions were systematically erased after his later treason. The room had gone completely silent, every person leaning forward to catch each word. Thomas Harrington's false claims of heroism were the basis for the substantial land grants that founded the Harrington family fortune, including portions of what became the Caldwell farm. Samuel discovered this truth, documented it meticulously, and was working to make it public when he mysteriously disappeared in 1987. William stepped forward, his composure cracking. "This is preposterous. Ancient history twisted to serve a modern agenda. Mr. Reeves is an outsider with no understanding of our community's traditions." "Actually," Frank Donovan interrupted from the audience, "Ethan has shown more respect for our real traditions, truth-telling, neighborly support, historical integrity than those who've twisted history for personal gain." Murmurs of agreement followed his statement. Commissioner Davis studied the documents before her with professional detachment. "These are serious claims, Mr. Reeves, with potential legal implications far beyond a simple preservation order." She looked up, addressing William directly. "In light of these developments, I'm tabling your petition until these historical and legal questions can be properly addressed." It wasn't a definitive victory, but it was a crucial first step, bringing the hidden truth into the public forum, where it could no longer be suppressed through private pressure and threats. As the meeting disbanded, townspeople gathered around. Ethan, Mia, and Rebecca eager to examine the evidence and discuss its implications. Catherine Winters moved through the crowd, collecting quotes and perspectives for her story, which now had the additional angle of a small-town showdown over historical truth. William Harrington left without further comment, his expression unreadable, but his hasty departure speaking volumes. The power dynamic had shifted, perhaps not permanently, but significantly. The truth Samuel had protected for so long was finally emerging into the light. A year later, Ethan stood on the porch of the fully restored farmhouse, watching the sunset over fields that were productive once again. The historical revelation had indeed sparked legal challenges to some Harrington family land holdings, but the most profound impact had been on the community itself, a reckoning with its past that had ultimately strengthened rather than divided it. The farm had become something of a historical site itself, with a small museum in the renovated barn displaying Samuel's research and the evidence he had protected at such cost. Visitors came regularly, drawn by the remarkable story that had made national headlines and the chance to see where it had all unfolded. Mia had received tenure at the university. Her work on historical revisionism and the ethical dimensions of correcting the historical record earning widespread academic recognition. She visited often, continuing her research and helping manage the educational aspects of what they now called the Caldwell Historical Farm. Rebecca had become more than a neighbor and ally. Her practical wisdom and unwavering support during the tumultuous revelations had evolved into a deeper connection that neither had anticipated but both now treasured. The money from the attic had funded the initial restoration, but the farm now sustained itself through a combination of agricultural operations, educational programs, and historical tourism. Ethan had found a way to merge his business acumen with his newfound passion for historical truth and community building. As he watched the golden light fading over the mountains, Ethan reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him here. His greatest failure, the collapse of his company and his subsequent descent into near homelessness, had led him improbably to his most meaningful success. The man who had arrived in Mapleton with his last $500 and a car full of regrets had discovered something more valuable than the cash in Samuel's attic, the understanding that rock bottom could be a foundation, that community was the truest form of wealth, that standing for truth, even against powerful opposition, was the most rewarding venture of all. The door opened behind him, and Rebecca joined him on the porch, handing him a cup of coffee. "Penny, for your thoughts," she said, settling into the chair beside his. "Just thinking about Samuel," Ethan replied. "Wondering if he somehow knew, when he hid those documents and wrote that final journal entry, that someday someone would find them and continue his work." "I think he did," Rebecca said softly. "That's why he never gave up, never sold this place, never stopped believing that the truth would eventually come to light." As darkness settled over the farm that had become his home, Ethan felt a profound gratitude for the desperate circumstance that had led him here. Sometimes, he reflected, our greatest opportunities come disguised as our worst disasters. Sometimes hitting bottom is exactly what we need to discover what truly matters. And sometimes a last desperate $500 can purchase not just a dilapidated arm, but a new beginning beyond anything we could have imagined. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.